Welcome to the debate. Okay, let's paint the picture. Dubai International Cricket Stadium, Sunday, September 28th, 2025. India has just, well, comprehensively beaten Pakistan, clinched their ninth Asia Cup title, 5-wicket victory. The stadium is absolutely buzzing, patriotic chants, real championship energy. And then it just stops. Everything grinds to a halt. What followed was, truly extraordinary. For about an hour, the winning Indian team simply refused. They would not come up to the podium for the trophy presentation. And eventually, the cup itself, the whole point, was sort of quietly taken away backstage.
It really was a bizarre moment, wasn't it? Utterly unprecedented for a major final like this. That whole electric atmosphere just fizzled into confusion and, frankly, a kind of diplomatic theater. The celebration was completely overshadowed. And that really brings us to the core question we need to unpack today. Was this refusal, this hour-long standoff, a necessary, a principled stand against the presenter, Mohsin Naqvi, and the politicization he arguably represented, or was it ultimately a counterproductive act? One that needlessly dragged geopolitical tensions onto the field and diminished the actual sporting achievement?
I'm going to argue that the refusal was not only justified, but necessary. It was a calculated, principled response to a failure, really, an institutional failure. It was about pushing back against the specific political actions of Mohsin Naqvi. The team essentially drew a line saying that when an organizer's conduct blurs those lines, contaminates the governing body itself, well, that's unacceptable. Silence in that moment, I think, would have been complicity.
And I see it quite differently. While, look, nobody denies the complex political backdrop, and yes, Naqvi's presence was controversial, definitely. But the decision to reject the ceremony itself, that, for me, fundamentally compromised the spirit of the competition. It was counterproductive. It took this amazing sporting achievement, this dominant win, and deliberately turned it into a political sideshow. In doing so, I think they actually reduced the significance of their own victory.
Well, to understand the principle, you really have to start with the individual they refuse to engage with, Mohsin Naqvi. The concentration of roles is just staggering. He's the president of the Asian Cricket Council, the ACC. Okay, but he's also Pakistan's interior minister, and he's also the chairman of the Pakistan Cricket Board. That's an incredible amount of power concentrated in one person, spanning sport and very high-level politics. So given that setup, the team's stance, I believe, was entirely justified based on his documented actions leading up to that final.
Okay, I grant you the multiple hats situation is problematic. It screams conflict of interest. But what specific actions pushed it over the edge? What turned that conflict into a crisis demanding such a drastic public rejection of the trophy itself?
It wasn't just a general feeling of unease, right? There were specific, concrete examples. Instances where Naqvi appeared to use his public profile, the very profile tied to his ACC presidency, for what looked like political point scoring. We know about his social media. There was that post referencing Cristiano Ronaldo's, the plane crash celebration. Now, at the time, that was widely seen as Naqvi making a subtle, kind of coded reference, aligning with certain narratives critical of India after a sensitive military incident. That's not just a slip-up. From the head of the ACC, it felt like political baiting. And maybe even more pointedly, he publicly called for the ICC, the International Cricket Council, to bring charges against Surya Kumar Yadav, an Indian player. Not for anything done on the field, mind you, but for showing support for victims of a terror attack. Now, when the head of the tournament's organizing body tries to penalize a player for expressing patriotism or perhaps just human sympathy, well, the line between sports governance and political maneuvering just dissolves, doesn't it? Refusing the cut from him specifically became a defense of their own integrity, I'd argue.
It's certainly a troubling sequence of events leading up to it. I concede that point. But you're focused entirely on the why, the motivation. My focus is squarely on the what happened next, the consequences.
And the consequence, honestly, was chaotic and undermined the very event Naqvi was presiding over, the execution of this stand. I'm sorry, I just don't see how it can be framed as effective.
But the chaos was part of the point, wasn't it?
How so? Look at what actually happened. An hour-long painful standoff. You had a stadium full of people, mostly Indian fans, remember, sitting there bewildered. The booing that eventually started, it wasn't for Pakistan. It was directed at the officials trying and failing to figure out what to do. We saw this scramble behind the scenes. Should they get someone else? There was talk about Khalid Rooney from the Emirates Cricket Board maybe stepping in. And while all this political theater is happening, what gets lost? The actual cricket. India's brilliant win, Kuldeep Yadav's performance, Tilak Varma's contribution, all instantly forgotten, replaced by procedural drama. It turned a celebration into a political negotiation.
But that negotiation was forced by the circumstances. That drama, as you call it, was crucial because it forced everyone, the organizers, the fans, the global audience, to confront the issue. You simply cannot separate sport and politics when the person handing out the trophy is perceived to be actively politicizing the players themselves. Naqvi's various roles and controversies, they made it impossible for him to act purely as a neutral ACC president in that moment. The refusal was perhaps the only way, the only language strong enough to communicate that the team wouldn't legitimize that blurring of lines. They forced a confrontation, yes, a confrontation with an institutional breakdown.
But again, I have to question the venue for that confrontation. Was the trophy ceremony, the climax of the entire tournament, the right place? If the aim was clarity on principle, the immediate result was just messy. Physical chaos. It wasn't just the hosts scrambling. The Pakistani team, the runners-up, they were treated to their dressing room too. The whole thing became unclear. For the average fan watching, did it clarify a principle, or did it just look like a confusing, dramatic refusal? And ironically, by digging in their heels, the Indian team actually allowed Naqvi to hold his ground. He didn't step aside. No neutral presenter was brought in. So the protesters didn't even get that small procedural win.
Maybe the small win wasn't the point. A procedural change is temporary. The larger victory, perhaps, is setting a marker, a precedent. Future teams facing officials they deem politically compromised might look back at this. The team wasn't just making a statement about one trophy presentation. Arguably, they were questioning the very structure that allowed Naqvi to be in that position.
Which brings us right to the next point, the impact on the fans and, well, the norms of sport. This wasn't just unusual. It was, as you said, unprecedented. A historic first, but maybe not in a good way. Think about the visual culture of cricket, of any championship. That moment, the captain lifting the trophy. It's iconic. It's the payoff. By staying in that dugout, the team denied that moment to thousands of their own supporters in the stadium. People who traveled, spent money, invested emotionally, and millions more watching worldwide. They denied them the satisfying conclusion, the visual proof of triumph. They broke that sort of unspoken agreement, didn't they, between champion and supporter?
I understand the symbolism, I really do. The trophy lift is powerful. But maybe, just maybe, in this specific context, this high-intensity rivalry with all the background noise, maybe the audience's priorities shifted too. The immediate reaction in the stadium wasn't solely confusion. You mentioned the buzz earlier. It was electric, yes, but filled with patriotic slogans supporting the team's stand. And social media, it wasn't all criticism. A lot of people were praising it as a stand for principles. That suggests, doesn't it, that for many fans, the principle behind the protest felt more significant, more triumphant even, than the physical silverware at that particular moment from that particular person. The act itself transcended the object. It forced that question. Where do we draw the line between sport and politics?
But you can't just discount the fans who simply wanted to cheer their team winning the cup, can you? The ones who weren't necessarily tuned in to the intricacies of ACC politics or Naqvi's specific actions. Their role, once the final ball is bowled, is surely just to celebrate the victory and acknowledge the crowd's support. By making the podium itself the battleground, they arguably denied a huge number of people that pure, unadulterated moment of sporting joy. And that act of, essentially, non-acknowledgement, it carries a weight. It sets a potentially dangerous precedent. I mean, if every disagreement with an official now justifies refusing the trophy, where does that end? Does the whole ceremonial aspect just collapse?
Look, I think we have to be careful not to generalize. This felt like an extreme case, right? A conflict of interest bordering on, or at least perceived as, political antagonism from the top official towards the players. This wasn't just some minor disagreement over an umpire's call, and that really gets to the heart of the efficacy question. You see the standoff as counterproductive. I actually think its success lies in the drama it created.
Success? But how can you call it success when the trophy ended up being whisked away backstage? That feels like failure, doesn't it?
Because the drama, the sheer awkwardness of it all, shone an unavoidable global spotlight on the situation. Naqvi standing there, the hour-long delay broadcast internationally, it ensures that the 2025 Asia Cup isn't just remembered for the scoreline. It's remembered for this post-match crisis. And that intense public pressure, that puts the ACC and the ICC in a really difficult position moving forward. They either have to address these structural issues, can figures with such deep political ties genuinely govern neutrally, or they risk future tournaments dissolving into similar chaos. The team used their platform, their moment of victory, to force a conversation about institutional standards. That, I think, is a form of success, a long-term one.
That's a very abstract definition of success, though. Let's talk concrete results on the day. Yes, the protest isolated Naqvi, made him look awkward, but it achieved no formal resolution then and there. The trophy being quietly whisked away, that's the opposite of resolution. There was no alternative presenter, no clear handing over of authority. The whole thing just stopped. Incomplete. Only the individual awards were given out, almost grudgingly it felt. So the protest generated noise, generated drama, absolutely. But it didn't actually change the outcome in that critical moment. It left the championship feeling unfinished.
I would argue it fundamentally shifted the narrative of the championship. The team acted to protect its integrity. They refused, essentially, to be political props for an official whose actions had, in their view, compromised his neutrality. Protecting that integrity, refusing to participate in what they saw as a compromised ceremony, that is the significant long-term win. Regardless of the messy logistics, the story isn't just who won, it's about what principles were defended.
I do accept the motivation. It seems clear it came from a place of wanting to defend their integrity, perhaps push for change. But when the method chosen leads to an hour of public confusion, a missing trophy moment, and an unfinished ceremony, it's really hard for me to see how that served the tournament, the fans, or even the team's own stunning victory particularly well. The execution, I maintain, created unnecessary conflict and ultimately muddied the waters around a great sporting achievement.
And I maintain the refusal, disruptive as it was, acted as a vital defense, a necessary pushback against clear instances where a top official let politics contaminate his sporting role. It forced an essential, if uncomfortable, conversation onto the world stage.
And on that point, we are certainly in agreement. It's clear we remain divided on whether the tactic was right or effective, but whether you view it as a principled stand or a counterproductive mess, there's no denying this. That bizarre hour in Dubai is going to fuel some very big, very necessary discussions within the ACC, the ICC, and the wider cricket world.
Absolutely. It puts the spotlight firmly on how cricket, and perhaps all international sport, handles governance and ceremony, especially when these deep-seated geopolitical rivalries are involved. It forces administrators and indeed fans to think hard about where those lines should be drawn in the future.
A point on which we can definitely concur.